He was not supposed to be standing there, not with the roof still breathing like a wounded thing beneath the rain. Before anyone saw the danger, the K-9 saw the life underneath it. Before anyone heard the faint sound buried below the cracked shingles and broken beams, Rex was already on that collapsed roof, paws spread wide, amber eyes fixed on the gap where the house had folded in on itself. He did not bark like a dog trying to scare people away. He barked like a soldier giving one last warning. Stay back. Not yet. Something is still alive. The old farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel road outside Cedar Falls, Iowa, half hidden behind bare cottonwoods and waist-high winter weeds. Dawn had only just begun to lift, turning the sky the color of wet steel, and a cold March rain tapped softly against the shattered windows. The air smelled of soaked pine, old dust, and the sharp mineral scent that comes after wood gives way under too much weight. A storm had passed through the county before sunrise, hard enough to tear gutters loose and push one side of the farmhouse roof down into the kitchen below. Now the place stood silent, leaning in the mud like it had finally grown too tired to hold its memories. Sergeant Daniel Harper saw the German Shepherd first. He had been driving home from an early shift at the County Veterans Center when his truck tires crunched over scattered branches along Route 18. Daniel was 36, tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cropped brown hair, pale skin weathered by sun and wind, and gray-blue eyes that still measured every doorway before he entered. The Marine Corps had taught him how to notice what others missed. Grief had taught him how to move quietly around broken things. He had not planned to stop. He had coffee going cold in the cup holder, mud on his boots, and a folded flag pin clipped to the visor above him, the one his younger brother had given him before his last deployment. But then Rex appeared on the roofline, standing where no dog should have stood, his sable coat darkened by rain, his body rigid over the sagging boards. Daniel eased the truck onto the shoulder. For a moment he only watched. Rex looked back at him. Through the mist, ears high, chest heaving, tail low. There was intelligence in that stare. Not panic, not confusion, a request. Daniel stepped out slowly, raising one hand the way he would to a frightened recruit or a stray dog at a roadside shelter. Easy, boy, he said, voice low enough to belong to the rain. I see you. Rex answered with one sharp bark, then turned and pressed his nose toward a narrow break in the collapsed roof. The whole structure gave a long wooden groan. Daniel stopped moving. A piece of gutter slid loose and dropped into the weeds with a dull clatter. Rex did not flinch. That was what unsettled Daniel most. Any ordinary dog would have run from the sound. Rex stood his ground, paws trembling against the slick shingles, guarding that broken place as if the roof itself had become a battlefield and retreat was not an option. Daniel scanned the farmhouse. The porch had sunk on one side. The front door hung crooked. A mailbox near the drive read Whitaker, though the letters had faded until they looked almost ghost-like. No cars, no lights, no voices, just the rain, the creaking wood, and the German Shepherd refusing to leave. Daniel took 2 careful steps closer. Rex growled then, not at him, but beneath him. A low, urgent sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest. Daniel froze again. Then he heard it. Faint, thin, almost swallowed by the rain. A small cry from under the roof. It came once, then stopped. Daniel felt the world narrow. His hand moved instinctively to the dog tags beneath his jacket, 2 worn pieces of metal resting against his chest. For a second, he was no longer on a gravel road in Iowa. He was in another place, years ago, listening for breath beneath dust and silence, praying that one more sound would come. He swallowed hard and came back to the present. All right, he whispered. All right, Rex. Show me. The dog's ears twitched at his name, though Daniel did not know how he knew it. Maybe it was stitched on the torn blue collar around the shepherd's neck, half hidden beneath wet fur. Maybe some names simply fit the shape of loyalty. Rex lowered himself and stretched one paw toward the gap, careful, deliberate. Pointing, Daniel moved around the side of the house where the roof had folded lower, boots sinking into the mud. Every few feet, the beams above gave another tired complaint. He kept his steps light. 12 feet away, the opening came into view. Broken shingles had formed a slanted pocket against an old pantry wall, and beneath the tangle of insulation and splintered boards, something pale shifted in the dark. Daniel crouched. Rain ran down the back of his neck. Rex whined once, soft and broken. Daniel leaned closer, holding his breath. The sound came again. Not a full cry. Not even close. Just a fragile breath pushing through the debris, small enough that most people would have missed it. Daniel looked up at the dog standing above him, soaked and shaking, but still guarding the place with everything he had left. "Don't you move," Daniel murmured. "I'm going to get them out." Rex blinked slowly, as if he understood every word. Then the roof creaked again, louder this time, and dust slipped through the gap like gray snow. Daniel placed one hand against the broken beam, feeling the vibration travel into his palm. The house was still settling. He had minutes, maybe less. But somewhere under that collapsed roof, hidden in the cold and dark, a life was waiting for a stranger to believe it was worth the risk. Daniel moved closer to the opening on his knees, letting the mud soak through his jeans without noticing. The rain had softened to a mist, but the farmhouse kept making small sounds, little tired pops in the walls, the faint ticking of water dripping through torn insulation, the slow bend of wood under strain. He had learned long ago that danger did not always shout. Sometimes it whispered in the spaces between breaths. Rex stood above him, balanced on a strip of roof that should not have held his weight, his claws dug into the shingles, his wet collar pressed flat against his neck. Daniel lifted his hand toward him. "Stay, boy," he said. Rex did not move. His eyes stayed locked on the dark pocket beneath the beam. Daniel pulled a flashlight from the side pocket of his truck jacket and clicked it on. The beam cut into the shadows, catching dust, rain, and the splintered ribs of the old roof. At first he saw only broken boards, a crushed plastic bucket, and the corner of a faded quilt pinned beneath debris. Then something moved under the quilt. Small, weak, alive. Daniel's chest tightened. "Hey," he called softly, keeping his voice steady. "Can you hear me?" No answer came from the dark. Only another thin sound, a breath trying to become a cry. Daniel shifted the flashlight lower and saw the edge of a little hand, pale with cold, fingers curled around a piece of blue fabric. He stopped breathing for half a second. Not because of fear, because of recognition. Every hard part of him, every trained instinct, every old memory of carrying people through smoke and dust, narrowed into one clear command. Do not let go. He reached into the gap, but a broken crossbeam blocked his arm. It was wedged tight, angled between the pantry wall and a fallen roof joist. Daniel tested it gently. The wood groaned. Rex gave a sharp warning bark from above. Daniel froze. "You are right," he whispered. "Too much." He pulled back and scanned the structure again. There had to be another angle. The farmhouse had a small side porch, half collapsed but lower to the ground. If he could get under the fallen section from there, he might reach the trapped child without shifting the main beam. He looked toward the road. No sirens yet. No neighbors. The nearest house sat a quarter-mile away past the cornfield, its windows dark in the morning gray. Daniel took out his phone. One bar flickered, vanished, then returned. He dialed emergency services, keeping his eyes on Rex. "Cedar County Emergency Services, what is your location?" A woman's voice answered. "Old Whitaker Place, off Route 18, about 2 miles west of Cedar Falls," Daniel said. "Partial roof collapse. I have at least one child trapped, conscious status unknown. Need fire and medical." The dispatcher's tone sharpened. "Are you safe where you are?" Daniel looked at the roof, at Rex, at the trembling gap in the debris. "Not exactly, ma'am. But we have time if we use it right." He ended the call only after giving the nearest mile marker, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. Rex was whining now, a low sound that carried something almost human. Daniel climbed carefully around to the side porch, testing every board before trusting it. The old steps sagged but held. Water dripped from the roofline onto his shoulders. Inside, the kitchen was dim and tilted, cabinets pulled away from the wall, dishes scattered across the floor like white shells. Daniel stepped through broken plaster and stopped near the pantry. From this side, the fallen roof formed a narrow tunnel no wider than 2 feet. He lowered himself flat, pressed his cheek briefly against the cold floor, and shone the flashlight under the beam. The child was there. A little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, wrapped partly in the faded quilt, her face dusty, her light brown hair stuck to her forehead with rainwater and plaster powder. Beside her, almost hidden beneath the quilt, something smaller moved. Daniel stared, trying to understand what he was seeing. Then Rex barked from above, urgent and pleading. The little girl's eyes fluttered. She looked toward the light, unfocused but awake. "Hey there, sweetheart," Daniel said, his voice dropping into the gentlest shape it knew. "My name is Daniel. I am here to help you." Her lips trembled. "Daisy," she whispered. Daniel nodded slowly, as if that one word was the most important briefing he had ever received. "Daisy, that is a good strong name. Are you hurting anywhere?" She swallowed, eyes filling with fear, but she did not cry. "Nana told me to stay under the table." Daniel's gaze moved past her to the little form pressed against her chest. It was a puppy, a tiny German shepherd pup, sable and soaked, wrapped in the same quilt, breathing in quick, fragile tremors. Daisy had one arm around it, protecting it with the fierce seriousness only a child could carry. Daniel's throat tightened. "Is that your puppy?" he asked. Daisy shook her head slightly. "Rex's baby," she whispered. "He pushed us here." The words landed quietly, but Daniel felt them move through him like a church bell in an empty town. Above them, Rex shifted and whined, listening to the voice beneath the wreckage. Daniel looked up through a split in the boards and saw the shepherd's amber eyes staring down into the narrow, dark. He had not been guarding a roof. He had been guarding family. Daniel reached one arm into the tunnel, palm open. "Daisy, I need you to listen to me. We are going to do this slow. No rushing. No fear if we can help it." She nodded, barely. The puppy gave a weak squeak, and Rex answered with one soft bark from above. Daniel smiled despite the cold. "That is him," he said. "He is right here. He did not leave you." Daisy's chin trembled then. Not from pain, Daniel thought. From the terrible relief of being found. He stretched farther in, fingertips brushing the quilt. The beam above them creaked again. Dust drifted over his sleeve. Daniel paused, counted one breath, then another. Outside, far away through the rain and cottonwoods, the first siren began to rise. Daniel adjusted his grip on the quilt, lifting Daisy and the tiny pup carefully as he crawled backward through the narrow tunnel, feeling the weight of both bodies shift with each movement. Rainwater ran down his sleeves, soaking into the fabric of his jacket, but he did not notice. His eyes stayed fixed on Rex above, whose stance remained vigilant, tail low, ears high, chest heaving with quiet intensity. Every step Daniel took was measured, as if the slightest miscalculation could undo the fragile balance that had kept the child and puppy safe this long. Outside, the siren grew closer, its wail bending through the mist and the still falling rain. Daniel could hear the distant shuffle of boots from first responders moving through the mud, their voices calling out names and instructions. But for now, it was just him, Daisy, the pup, and Rex. He pushed one last beam aside carefully, testing its weight with his shoulder. It groaned, small splinters raining down, and Daniel froze, feeling the vibration travel up his arm. Rex barked softly from above, a warning and a reassurance at once. Daniel whispered to Daisy, "Almost there. Keep your hands around him," he said, his voice calm but firm, and she nodded against his chest, clutching the puppy like it was a piece of her own heart. The small tunnel seemed longer than it should have been, each movement sending rainwater dripping from overhead into Daniel's hair and the folds of his jacket. He glanced at the puppy's small chest rising and falling in quick bursts and allowed a faint smile to cross his face. The creature was alive. That was the most important truth in the world right now. Finally, Daniel shifted himself through the last few feet of debris and emerged onto the side porch, knees sinking into mud and scattered shingles. The morning gray had begun to lighten, hints of sun filtering through the mist and clouds, touching the wet surfaces with silver. He laid Daisy gently down, letting her wrap her arms around the puppy, and took a moment to look back at the house. The roof still sagged, the beams looked fragile, but no one else was under them anymore. Rex leapt down from the roof with practiced grace, landing beside Daniel, his paws slipping slightly on the wet wood, and pressed his head against Daniel's leg, wet nose brushing his sleeve. The bond between man and dog, forged in years of training and trust, carried a quiet weight of relief and gratitude. The emergency responders arrived moments later, stepping carefully onto the side porch. One of them knelt beside Daisy, speaking gently, and Daniel moved back slightly, letting them assess her condition. The child's small fingers uncurled slightly, her eyes focused on Daniel for reassurance, and he smiled, offering a nod that spoke more than words could convey. Rex circled around Daniel and Daisy, sniffing the edges of the porch, making sure nothing was left behind, his body taut with the same vigilance that had guided every move until now. The puppy let out a tiny bark, half playful, half nervous, and Rex's ears pricked, acknowledging the sound as if confirming that all was finally safe. Daniel took a deep breath, letting the tension in his shoulders melt into the soft drizzle, and allowed himself to feel the quiet triumph of a mission accomplished without words, without fanfare, just instinct, trust, and the small, extraordinary miracle of survival. The mist lifted gradually, and the first shafts of morning sun glinted off the wet shingles and the glimmering leaves of nearby cottonwoods. Daniel knelt beside Daisy again, letting the puppy wriggle free into her small arms, and for a moment the world narrowed to three figures standing on a rain-slick porch, breathing in the cold, fresh air, the quiet echo of survival ringing through the mist. Each heartbeat matched the rhythm of the rain fading away. Daniel ruffled Rex's damp fur, amber eyes meeting his in a shared understanding, and then he glanced at Daisy, who smiled faintly around the little puppy pressed to her chest. No words were necessary. The miracle had spoken for itself, and in that soft, rain-scented light, Daniel, Daisy, and Rex stood together, the quiet heroism of a morning that could have gone differently, now etched into memory, like a stone carved smooth by time and care. The paramedics wrapped Daisy in a silver thermal blanket, while the puppy stayed tucked beneath her chin, no bigger than a loaf of bread, and trembling against the rhythm of her heartbeat. Daniel stood nearby with Rex pressed against his boot, watching the responders work with the quiet focus of a man who knew when to step back and let other hands take over. The rain had faded into a fine mist, and the old farmhouse seemed softer now in the morning light, less like a ruin and more like something tired that had finally exhaled. Daisy kept looking toward the kitchen door, her eyes searching past the firefighters, past the porch, past the broken beams where the roof had folded into the house. Daniel noticed it before anyone asked. He crouched beside her, careful not to crowd the paramedic checking her pulse. "Daisy," he said gently, "is there someone else we need to know about?" Her small fingers tightened around the puppy. "Nana," she whispered. Daniel felt the words settle in the cold air. The paramedic paused, his expression changing. "Where was she, sweetheart?" Daniel asked. Daisy looked toward the field behind the house, where a narrow path cut between the cottonwoods and an old red barn leaned under a blanket of wet vines. "She went to get Rex," Daisy said. The storm was loud. He would not come inside. Then the roof made a big sound. She swallowed hard, trying to be brave, but her voice thinned. "Nana told me to hide under the table and hold the puppy." Daniel turned slowly toward the barn. Rex had already lifted his head. His ears angled forward, and his body changed in a way Daniel recognized instantly. The dog was no longer relieved. He was listening. Somewhere beyond the house, beyond the drip of rain from the gutters and the low murmur of emergency radios, there was another thread of unfinished duty pulling him tight. The fire captain, a broad man with a gray mustache and rainwater on the brim of his helmet, stepped beside Daniel. "We have crews checking the main structure now," he said. "If someone went out back, we will search the property." Daniel nodded, but Rex had already taken 3 steps toward the field. He stopped, looked back at Daniel, and gave one short bark. Not frantic. Certain. Daniel knew that sound. He had heard it from working dogs on training ranges, in airports, in wide empty places where one animal's nose could read the world better than any map. He looked at the captain. "That dog knows something." The captain studied Rex for a half second, then gave a small nod. "Stay clear of the unstable structures, Sergeant." Daniel did not correct the title. He only touched Rex's wet collar and said lead. Rex moved down the porch steps and across the muddy yard, nose low, paws cutting through puddles and flattened grass. Daniel followed with 2 firefighters behind him, their boots sinking deep into the soft earth. The path to the barn smelled of wet hay, old metal, and storm-bent leaves. Every fence post was slick and dark. The wind had knocked loose a strip of tin roofing, and it tapped gently against the side of the barn with a hollow, lonely sound. Rex stopped halfway across the yard, near a fallen cottonwood limb. He sniffed the ground, circled once, then pushed his nose beneath a patch of soaked burlap caught on the branch. Daniel knelt and lifted it. Underneath lay a knitted blue mitten, small and worn, the kind an older woman might keep in a coat pocket for years. Rex sniffed it, whined once, and pulled toward the barn. Daniel looked back at the firefighters. We keep going. Inside the barn, the air was colder. Shafts of gray light slipped through gaps in the siding, turning the dust into thin floating threads. The storm had pushed one door, half off its track, and rain had blown across the hay-strewn floor. Tools hung along one wall. An old tractor sat under a tarp. In the far corner, several feed sacks had toppled beside a stack of wooden crates. Rex moved straight toward them, then stopped. His whole body went still. Daniel heard nothing at first. Then, beneath the slow drip of water into a metal bucket, there came a faint tapping. 3 soft knocks. Then silence. One of the firefighters called out, "Ma'am, can you hear us?" Another tapping sound answered, weak but clear. Daniel dropped to one knee beside the crates. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "my name is Daniel Harper. Daisy is safe. Rex is here too." For a moment, nothing moved. Then a fragile voice came from behind the fallen crates. Thin as paper, but steady enough to carry hope. "Daisy is safe?" Daniel closed his eyes for 1 second. "Yes, ma'am. She is safe. And she is holding the puppy." Rex pushed forward then, whining deeply, trying to squeeze his muzzle through the narrow gap. Daniel held him back with one hand, not to stop him, but to steady him. The firefighters began moving the crates carefully, one at a time, calling instructions to each other in low voices. No rushing. No careless heroics. Just patience, the kind that saves more than strength ever could. When the last crate shifted aside, they found Eleanor Whitaker seated against the barn wall, wrapped in an old canvas coat, her silver hair damp at the edges, her face pale with cold, but her eyes bright the moment she saw Rex. The German shepherd stepped forward and rested his head in her lap. Eleanor's hand rose slowly, trembling as it settled between his ears. "You stubborn old boy," she whispered. "You went back for them." Rex closed his eyes under her touch, and Daniel looked away for a moment, because some things were too holy to stare at directly. Outside, the clouds began to break, and a pale beam of sunlight reached through the barn door, falling across the muddy floor, the old blue mitten, and the dog who had refused to choose which life mattered more. Daniel helped Eleanor to her feet carefully, keeping one hand steady on Rex as the German shepherd pressed close, warm and protective. The puppy nestled deeper into Daisy's arms, whimpering softly but safe, and Daniel felt the tension in his shoulders slowly ebb as he surveyed the aftermath of the storm. The barn smelled of wet hay and earth, mixed with the faint scent of the rain-soaked quilt still wrapped around the little pup. Outside, the mist had lifted further, revealing streaks of sunlight through the cottonwoods and the edge of the red barn's roof glinting in the early morning. Daniel guided Daisy and Eleanor toward the truck, moving slowly over the soft ground where puddles mirrored the gray sky. Every step required care, but the urgency remained gentle, carried in the rhythm of Rex's movements alongside them. The German shepherd's paws made quiet, steady impressions in the mud, keeping close to Daniel, watching for any sign of trouble. He could hear the faint calls of the emergency crew moving back toward the farmhouse, voices echoing softly across the field, and he felt a small measure of relief that help had arrived without the chaos of panic. Daisy's small hands tightened around the pup as they reached the edge of the yard, and she glanced up at Daniel with an expression that was a mixture of wonder and lingering worry. "It is all right now," Daniel said softly, his voice carrying in the crisp morning air. "You are safe." The puppy blinked up at her with tiny amber eyes, trusting and curious, and she smiled. Eleanor adjusted the coat around her shoulders, still wet but steady, and reached down to pat Rex, who leaned into her hand with his ears relaxed but alert. The bond between the animals and the humans was palpable, a silent rhythm that needed no words. Daniel checked the straps of his jacket, brushing away small bits of debris, and then looked toward the farmhouse one last time before turning back to the dirt road that led away from it. The old roof still sagged under the weight of the storm's memory, and the broken shingles reflected the sunlight in muted glimmers, but nothing else stirred beneath them. He could feel the pulse of the morning, a quiet cadence that carried promise instead of fear. Daisy skipped slightly as they approached the truck, the puppy resting against her chest, and Daniel adjusted his hand on her shoulder to steady her over a small puddle. Rex moved to the driver's side, tilting his head at Daniel, as if confirming that the path was clear. Daniel allowed himself a breath he had not realized he was holding, the first in what felt like hours. The world had contracted to the narrow space of the collapsed roof, the crate of hay, the tiny voices beneath it, and now it expanded again into the open air, the wet grass, the mist lifting, the sunlight touching the field, and the distant tree-line moving gently in the breeze. Daniel opened the passenger door for Eleanor and Daisy, helping them settle in carefully while the puppy nestled further into Daisy's lap, ears twitching at every faint sound. Rex jumped up onto the running board, pressing close to Daniel as he climbed into the truck, and for a long moment the two of them simply sat, listening to the quiet sounds of the morning, the residual drip of water from the barn roof, the soft rustle of leaves, the occasional call of a bird returning to the trees. It was a moment of stillness and relief, a pause after the tension, the fear, and the waiting. Daniel reached out to scratch behind Rex's ears, feeling the dog lean into the touch, and he allowed himself a brief smile. This is what it had been about, he thought. Not the roof, not the storm, not even the calls or the rush. It had been about keeping life safe, about holding it steady until someone could reach it. The truck engine started quietly, a soft rumble in the field, and Daniel guided it along the muddy path, watching the faces of Daisy and Eleanor in the side mirror. They were safe. That was all that mattered. Rex moved his head to watch the road ahead, alert and ready, and Daniel felt the familiar comfort of his K9 partner beside him, the small miracle of the morning resting between them, a living testament to patience, instinct, and the quiet courage it takes to be first on the scene, the hand steady in the storm, the heart open to the fragile lives that trust us to act. The road to Cedar Falls Memorial Clinic was only 7 miles long, but that morning it felt like a passage between two different lives. Behind them, the Whitaker farmhouse disappeared into the gray distance, its broken roof and muddy yard growing smaller in the rearview mirror until the cottonwoods swallowed it from sight. Ahead, the county road opened between wet cornfields, every stalk from last season bent low and shining beneath the clearing sky. Daniel kept both hands on the wheel, driving slower than usual because the gravel was soft from the storm and because Daisy sat in the back seat with Eleanor beside her, wrapped in blankets, holding the tiny German Shepherd pup as if the whole morning depended on the rhythm of its breath. Rex sat upright in the front passenger seat, too disciplined to climb into the back, too worried to look away from them. Every few seconds, he turned his head, ears lifting at the smallest sound from the puppy. The little one answered once with a thin, sleepy squeak. Rex exhaled through his nose, and Daniel almost smiled. "You hear him," Daniel said quietly. "He is still fighting." Rex's amber eyes moved to Daniel's face, steady and solemn. Eleanor reached forward from the back seat, her hand trembling as it rested briefly on Rex's shoulder. "His name is not Rex by accident," she said. "My husband named him after his first working dog. Said a good dog carries a name like a lantern." Daniel glanced at her in the mirror. "Your husband served?" "Marines," Eleanor said. "Vietnam. His name was Thomas Whitaker. He passed 4 years ago this spring." Daniel nodded, and something softened in his expression. He knew that pause after a name. Some names did not end when the person was gone. They stayed in rooms, in barns, in the shape of a dog's loyalty. Daisy looked up from the puppy. "Nana says Grandpa Tom taught Rex all the important things." Daniel smiled gently. "Sounds like he taught him well." Eleanor looked out the window, watching rainwater flash silver along the ditch. "Thomas used to say dogs remember promises better than people do. I thought he was just being sentimental. Then this old boy spent a whole night outside that roof, guarding my granddaughter and that last pup like he had been given orders from heaven." Her voice wavered on the final word, but she did not break. Daisy pressed her cheek against the puppy's head. "He was the smallest," she whispered. "His brothers went to families last week. He was supposed to leave tomorrow. Rex kept bringing him to my feet. Like he knew." Daniel's fingers tightened around the wheel. Outside, the first true sunlight slipped beneath the clouds, painting the wet blacktop in pale gold. He thought about all the times he had seen warnings arrive in ways no one could explain. A dog refusing to enter a room. A silence that felt wrong. A hand touching a shoulder seconds before a decision changed. Not miracles with thunder. Small mercies. Quiet ones. At the clinic, a nurse met them beneath the covered entrance with a wheelchair for Eleanor and a warm towel for the puppy. The building smelled of coffee, antiseptic, and rain-soaked coats, ordinary smells that somehow felt sacred after the dust and cold of the farmhouse. Daisy would not release the pup until Daniel knelt beside her and said, "The doctor is going to help him breathe easier. You can stay close." She looked at Rex, who stood beside Daniel with his nose nearly touching the bundle. Only then did she let the nurse lift the puppy into the towel. Rex followed so closely that the nurse paused. Daniel gave a faint nod. He is family. Nobody argued. In the small examination room, Dr. Melissa Grant, a calm woman in her 40s with kind brown eyes and a stethoscope tucked into her coat pocket, worked with quiet efficiency. She checked Daisy first, then Eleanor, then turned her attention to the puppy warming under a soft lamp. The pup was cold, tired, and hungry, but his heartbeat was there, quick and stubborn beneath her fingertips. Daisy sat on the edge of a chair, wrapped in a blanket, swinging her muddy boots above the floor. Daniel stood near the door, arms folded loosely, while Rex lay beside the exam table, head lifted, refusing to rest. Dr. Grant finally looked up. "He has a chance," she said. "A good one, if he keeps warming up." Daisy's eyes filled before she smiled. Eleanor closed her hand over her mouth. Daniel lowered his gaze, the relief moving through him slowly, almost painfully. Rex rose and placed his front paws carefully against the base of the table, just high enough to see the puppy. The little pup stirred, opened his tiny mouth, and made the smallest sound. Rex answered with a low rumble from deep in his chest, not a growl, not a warning, but something softer, a sound like recognition. Daisy wiped her face with the corner of her blanket. "He is talking to him," she whispered. Daniel watched Rex lower his head until his nose almost touched the towel. For a moment, nobody in the room moved. Not the doctor, not Eleanor, not Daniel. The clinic lights hummed softly overhead, and outside the window, water dripped from the edge of the awning in bright, steady beads. Then the puppy pushed one tiny paw out from the towel and rested it against Rex's nose. It was not much, just a touch, barely the weight of a breath. But Eleanor began to cry quietly, and Daniel felt the old ache in his chest loosen by one small inch. Because sometimes rescue was not a loud victory. Sometimes it was a tiny paw finding its way back to warmth, and a faithful dog closing his eyes as if every mile, every storm, and every lonely hour had finally been worth it. By noon, the storm had moved east and left Cedar Falls shining in the strange clean light that comes only after rain. The clinic windows glowed with pale sun, and the wet parking lot reflected passing clouds like pieces of broken mirror. Inside, Daisy had fallen asleep in a chair with a blanket around her shoulders, her small muddy boots dangling above the floor, one hand still resting on the edge of the puppy's warming box. Eleanor sat beside her, wrapped in a dry coat a nurse had found in the donation closet, her silver hair combed back with trembling fingers, her eyes fixed on Rex as if she were afraid he might vanish if she looked away too long. Rex lay on the tile between Daniel and the examination table, his head on his paws, exhausted but unwilling to close his eyes. Daniel stood near the window holding a paper cup of coffee gone cold, watching the road beyond the glass. He should have left after the doctor said Daisy and Eleanor were stable. He had given his statement to the fire captain. He had answered the deputy's questions. He had done what a stranger was supposed to do, and still his boots would not move toward the door. Something about that old farmhouse, that child under the quilt, that loyal dog standing on a roof that could have given way beneath him, had opened a room inside Daniel he had kept locked for years. Dr. Grant stepped in quietly, carrying a small clipboard. "The puppy is responding well," she said. "His temperature is coming up. No signs of serious injury. He needs rest, feeding, and a quieter night than the one he just had." Daisy stirred but did not wake. Eleanor closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank God." Rex lifted his head at the sound of the doctor's voice, then looked toward the warming box. Dr. Grant smiled. "He checks on him every 3 minutes. I have treated service dogs before. This one has that same look." Daniel glanced down. He has the look of someone who knows the job is not finished. Eleanor heard him and gave a soft laugh, though it carried sadness at the edges. "That is exactly what Thomas used to say." Daniel turned from the window. "Did Rex work with your husband?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "Not officially in the way people think. Rex was never military issued. Thomas found him at a county shelter after his first owner passed. Said the dog had too much sense to spend his life behind bars. He trained him for search and rescue with the volunteer team. Floods, missing hikers, tornado drills, old farm collapses. Nothing fancy, just a man and a dog showing up where things had gone wrong. Her hand drifted to the blue mitten folded in her lap, the one Rex had found in the mud. After Thomas died, Rex would sleep by his boots in the hall. For months. Would not let me move them. Daisy says he was keeping Grandpa's place warm. Daniel looked at the German Shepherd, and for a moment the clinic sounds faded. The soft beeping of a monitor. The squeak of a nurse's shoes. The distant ring of a phone. He saw instead the folded flag pin above his truck visor, his brother's steady grin, the last unopened letter stored in a shoebox on the top shelf of his closet. Some losses did not leave. They simply learned to walk beside you in silence. Eleanor studied him with the quiet wisdom of someone who recognized grief by its posture. You served, she said. Daniel nodded. United States Marine Corps. 8 years. My brother too. Her eyes softened. Is he nearby? Daniel looked back out the window. No, ma'am. He passed 3 winters ago. Training accident in Colorado. The words came out smoother than they used to, but they still carried weight. Rex rose then, as if the room itself had shifted. He crossed to Daniel and pressed his head against Daniel's hand. No command, no invitation, just the old instinct of a dog who could hear sorrow even when a man tried to bury it. Daniel's fingers settled into the wet fur behind Rex's ears. He had spent years avoiding that kind of comfort because comfort made the ache honest. But Rex did not ask permission to be kind. He simply stayed. Daisy woke a few minutes later when the puppy made a small sound from the warming box. She blinked, sat up, and looked around with sudden worry until she saw Eleanor, Daniel, and Rex all still there. Is he okay? She asked. Dr. Grant lifted the towel slightly so Daisy could see the tiny pup curled beneath the warm light. He is okay. Very tired, but okay. Daisy slipped from the chair and walked to the box, careful and barefoot because a nurse had taken her muddy socks. Rex stood beside her. The puppy opened his eyes just enough to find the room, then nudged weakly toward the sound of Daisy's voice. She smiled, and the whole clinic seemed to grow warmer. What will you name him? Daniel asked. Daisy looked at Rex, then at the puppy, then at the sunlight on the floor. Promise, she said. Eleanor drew in a soft breath. Daniel lowered his head, letting the name settle where words sometimes become prayers. Rex touched his nose to the edge of the towel, and the puppy, Promise, gave one small sigh before drifting back to sleep. Outside, a church bell rang once from somewhere downtown, clear and gentle across the wet streets. Daniel did not know why that sound reached him so deeply. Maybe because the morning had started with a broken roof and ended with a child naming what survived. Maybe because he had forgotten that hope could be this small, this warm, this alive. He looked at Rex, then at Daisy and Eleanor, and understood that he had not merely stopped on the side of a road. He had been led there, by rain, by memory, by a faithful dog, by something quiet enough to miss and strong enough to save. The name stayed with Daniel long after Dr. Grant said it would be another hour before Daisy and Eleanor could leave. Promise. It seemed too small a word for everything it had to carry, yet it fit the puppy curled beneath the warming light, tiny chest rising and falling, one paw tucked against the towel like a secret. Rex lay beside the table as if standing guard at a chapel door, his eyes half closed now, not from weakness, but from relief finally catching up with him. Daniel stepped into the hallway to call the Veterans Center and explain why he would not be returning that afternoon. His supervisor, a former Navy corpsman named Bill Reynolds, listened without interrupting. When Daniel finished, there was a long silence on the line. Then Bill said, "Sounds like you were exactly where you were supposed to be." Daniel looked through the clinic window at the wet street beyond, at the courthouse flag moving slowly in the wind. He wanted to answer with something simple. Maybe yes. Maybe just luck. But neither felt true enough. I do not know, Daniel said. The dog knew. Bill gave a quiet hum. They usually do. After the call, Daniel found Eleanor sitting alone near the vending machines, both hands wrapped around a paper cup of tea. Daisy was asleep again in the examination room, and Rex had refused to leave Promise. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and warm dust from the old heater. Eleanor looked smaller away from the barn and the broken house. her coat hanging loose around her shoulders, the blue mitten folded in her lap, like a piece of evidence from a life that had almost slipped away. Daniel sat on the chair beside her, leaving respectful space between them. "How long had you lived in that farmhouse?" he asked. Eleanor smiled faintly. 42 years. Thomas and I bought it when the roof was new and the maple tree out front was barely taller than a fence post. We raised our son there. Then we helped raise Daisy there after her parents had to move. For work. She looked down at the tea, watching steam fade into the clinic air. "Old houses make promises too, Sergeant. You believe they will hold one more winter, one more storm, one more family supper. Sometimes they just cannot." Daniel listened without trying to fix the sadness. That was something grief had taught him. Not every wound needed a speech. Some only needed a witness. Eleanor turned the mitten in her hand. "I should have called someone about that roof last fall. Thomas would have climbed up there himself if he were still around, foolish as that would have been. I kept thinking I had time." Daniel shook his head gently. "The storm did what storms do. You kept Daisy calm. Rex kept her safe. That matters." Eleanor's eyes filled, but she did not wipe them away. "And you stopped. Most people would have driven past. They would have thought it was not their place." Daniel glanced toward the examination room. Through the narrow window, he could see Rex's silhouette beside the table, unmoving, faithful as a statue. "I almost did," he said. "Then that dog looked at me like he already knew my name." Eleanor let out a soft breath that might have been a laugh. "Thomas used to say Rex did not find people. He assigned them." The words stayed between them for a moment, gentle and strange. A deputy arrived not long after with updates from the property. The house would need to be secured, but the family's important documents had been found dry inside a metal lockbox in the front closet. The barn was stable enough for now. Neighbors were already calling, offering guest rooms, blankets, spare clothes, and a place for Rex. Eleanor listened, nodding politely, but Daniel could see her trying to absorb the size of losing a home while still being grateful for what had lived. Daisy woke when a volunteer from the church brought a bag with clean clothes and a stuffed lamb someone had donated. She changed with the nurse's help, then came out wearing pink sneakers a little too big for her and a sweatshirt that read Cedar Falls Little League. She looked tired, washed pale by the morning, but when she saw Daniel, she smiled. "Where's Promise?" she asked. "Still warming up," Daniel said. "Rex is." "Watching him." Daisy nodded as if that solved everything. Then she climbed onto the chair beside Eleanor and leaned against her grandmother's arm. A few minutes later, Dr. Grant allowed them back into the room. Promise had been fed with a small bottle and now slept with the solemn exhaustion of something that had fought hard to stay. Rex lifted his head when they entered, and Daisy hurried to him first, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Thank you," she whispered into his damp fur. Rex closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against her shoulder. Daniel stood in the doorway, feeling something in him go quiet. Not empty. Quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when the heart stops defending itself for a little while. Eleanor stepped beside him. "We have nowhere proper to go tonight," she said softly, not as a complaint, only as truth. Daniel looked at Daisy, at Rex, at Promise sleeping beneath the warm light, and then at the rain-clean county road outside the window. His own house sat 10 minutes away, small and plain, with a fenced backyard, an unused guest room, and a silence he had mistaken for peace. He heard himself speak before doubt could talk him out of it. "I have room." Eleanor turned to him slowly. "Sergeant, you do not have to do that." Daniel watched Rex nuzzle Daisy's sleeve, watched the child smile for the first time without fear behind it. "I know," he said. "That is why I mean it." Outside, sunlight broke fully through the clouds, touching the clinic floor in a bright square of gold. Promise stirred in his towel, Rex raised his head, and Daisy reached for her grandmother's hand. No one called it a miracle, not out loud, but everyone in that room felt the shape of one, quiet and steady, settling over them like warmth after a long cold night. The afternoon sun had risen fully over Cedar Falls, washing the streets in pale gold that glimmered off the wet pavement and reflected in the windows of the small clinic. Daniel had arranged a small space in his home for Daisy, Eleanor, and the little puppy, Promise, so that the warmth of the house could meet the cold the storm had left behind. A soft rug lay by the radiator, towels folded neatly in a basket, and a small food and water station prepared for Rex and Promise. As he helped Daisy carefully step down from the car, he noticed how small she seemed. even though the sweatshirt hung loose and her boots were too large. She held Promise close, murmuring reassurances in a soft, steady voice, and Rex stayed beside her, vigilant but relaxed enough to allow her to lead. Eleanor leaned on Daniel's arm as they walked toward the house, a quiet gratitude in her movements, careful not to disturb the fragile moment. Inside, the warmth of the radiator and the scent of dry wood and coffee greeted them, filling the rooms with comfort that had been absent from the farmhouse all night. Daniel showed Daisy where she could sit with Promise, and the child carefully lowered the puppy onto a soft blanket, watching as the small chest rose and fell with each steady breath. Rex circled the room once, then settled near the base of the chair, ears twitching as he monitored the quiet activity. Daniel moved into the kitchen to set out snacks and a warm drink, the morning mist still clinging to his jacket. The quiet tick of the clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the distant call of a neighbor's crow created a rhythm that grounded him in the ordinary world after the extraordinary morning. Daisy leaned against Eleanor, whispering to Promise as she stroked the damp fur, and Daniel felt the old ache in his chest ease slightly, knowing that the child and the dog were safe. He poured himself a cup of coffee, letting the steam warm his hands, and looked at Rex, who lifted his head briefly, amber eyes locking on his, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Outside, the sun highlighted the bends in the road that led back to the courthouse and the familiar fields, and Daniel felt the weight of the morning settle into a gentle, steady rhythm. Eleanor adjusted her coat and smiled faintly at Daniel. "You have a calm way of handling chaos," she said, her voice soft, carrying the quiet strength that had guided her through many storms. Daniel nodded, brushing a hand along Rex's back, feeling the dog respond with a low exhale of satisfaction. "It had been a long night," he said. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "But sometimes the longest nights reveal what matters most." Daisy leaned down to press a soft kiss against Promise's head, and the puppy stirred, opening one small eye, tail flicking slightly in recognition. Rex nudged closer, resting his head near the puppy without crowding him, his body a living buffer of protection and reassurance. Daniel watched, feeling the rare clarity of a morning in which everything fragile had survived and nothing had been forgotten. Outside, the wind stirred the trees lightly, and the sunlight shifted across the hardwood floors, catching dust motes like tiny sparks of gold. Daniel turned to Eleanor and Daisy, letting his eyes sweep the room, taking in the warmth, the life, and the quiet triumph of survival. This was not a story that needed words. The room itself held the testament: a child safe, a puppy alive, a dog unwavering, and a man who had been led by instinct, courage, and quiet faith. Daniel knelt beside Daisy and Promise, brushing a gentle hand over the puppy's damp fur. "Everything is all right now," he whispered, and in the soft, unbroken quiet that filled the house, the weight of the morning dissolved into gratitude, into relief, into the simple, profound understanding that some lives are saved not by chance, but by the steady, faithful presence of those who care enough to act, those who listen even when the world is still, and those who remain when everything else has moved on. The afternoon light continued to settle over the small room, soft and unwavering, and Daniel, Daisy, Eleanor, Rex, and Promise rested together, the quiet miracle of survival lingering in the warmth, in the breathing of the puppy, in the steady gaze of the German shepherd, and in the hearts of those who had witnessed that morning's grace.